Hey everybody, welcome back. In this episode, we're just going to look a little bit closer at queries and parameters. This is something that we've already covered in a couple different places, and we've even introduced it a bit in Mongoose, but let's do a lesson on just using one of these so we get a better idea. Okay, so with this movie database app we've been making, I've added in this little extra form piece here, the filter by genre. And in here, it's a select option dropdown right now offering action, fantasy, and horror. Because of the 4 movies I have, they fit in those 3 genres. Now what I'd like to do is as soon as I click action, this list should re-render and show us just the action movies. Likewise for fantasy. So how do we make this work with the route that we built earlier? Let's adapt that route to be using Mongoose and MongoDB. But before we do that, let's look at the form addition that I've added here, just in case you'd like to have it as well. So I haven't put it in another component, just for the sake of being able to see it plainly here. I have a little H4 saying what it's for, and then a select option dropdown where the first option is empty, and the other 3 equate to action, fantasy, and horror. Notice the lower casing. That is important because in the site, I have these as lowercase as well. And we'll talk about some ways to control that later in this lesson. Okay, so here is that form. There's one function on change, handle filter. And all handle filter is doing right now is like a handle change. It's receiving the event object, and right now it says console logging the value. And that is why when you see this change here on the left, over on the right, you're seeing the value of the option selected being chosen. So we know what genre they'd like to look for. Now I did also add a little CSS here to the select if you'd like that. It's here at the bottom. I just added some width to it so it didn't span the whole width of the page along with the other elements. All right, and with that, we're ready to start building. So let's start off with the routes. If you recall, we've been going through and adapting all of these routes to be using Mongoose instead of the static database we had. And this one is still using that old code. So we're going to get rid of all of this code here and build a Mongoose search that finds all the movies that match a specific genre that the user has requested. And as if you recall, they are going to be sending that to this route as the query.genre. So let's do that now. All right, so whether it comes to using queries or parameters, you'll receive them the 2 different ways. If you recall, rec.query is the one object, and rec.params is for parameters like movie ID. We've used that with the find one and delete, find one and update. Genre is the same thing. We just have to access that other object that it's coming through. So what we want to do is find all movies that match a specific criteria. We've seen find one and delete, find one and update, and we're saying find this one specifically by an ID number. But we can also use find in the same way to return an array that brings everything back that matched your criteria. So we're going to say movie.find. And the filtering object we're going to give it, we're going to say find all movies whose genre property is equal to the rec.query.genre. And that's all we really have to do to make this any more special than our basic get route where we said just go find all the movies and immediately invoke that callback function when it's back. We are adding this first argument saying, hey, find them by this genre, and when you come back, then we'll continue the rest. So it'll come back with an error or the movies that should match that specific genre. We'll handle our error. And if everything went well, we'll send back the movies. Okay, so that's all that we should need. Right? Not too hard to filter by one thing. Let's go implement it on the front end and see how it works. So back to our app.js, we are receiving the genre they want to see through e.target.value. So instead of just console logging this, we'll do an axios.getRequest to the endpoint that is listening for genres, which is movies/search/genre, and then question mark to start the query string, and the genre will equal whatever they sent us as the e.target.value. Perfect. Okay, so let's handle the dot then, where we should get a response. Console log it for now, and a dot catch for the error, which we will also console log. Let's see if this works. So we'll go back to the code here. And let's refresh, get our movies back. And when we change this, we should get the response back from the server with the array of the things that fit that criteria. So let's start with action. All right, so we get back an array of 2 items. That's promising. And we've got Ninja Turtles and Iron Man. Okay, so that worked. Let's try fantasy. All right, we got 1. I'm guessing it's LOTR, but let's just double check. There we go. And lastly, horror. Okay, so that's looking like it's working just fine. Now we need to let the user know that it's working just fine. So how do we reset the view? How do we update the view on new data? Well, we just need a set state. So here in the response, we have response.data, which is our array of movies. We can set our movies back to the response.data. Now that's going to, if this had 4 movies in it like it did at the beginning, it'll now have 2. So we've lost 2 of them. We're going to have to go get our movies again if they want to see them all again. So you have to think about how you want to handle that for the user. Do they have a button to click to get them all? Do they just refresh? You know, it's something you get to think of. Let's see if this refreshes the view as we hope. All right, so we'll refresh. And let's try getting action. Perfect. Fantasy and horror. All right, but now nothing happens. So we could say maybe if they go to select a genre, we bring back the entire array, or they have to refresh to see them all. Again, that's up to you. We could see what this returns. Let's console log the event.target.value and see what is the value if they select this one. Notice we didn't give it a value. So if we come into here and refresh again, we'll do action, then we'll go back to select a genre. Notice the value just pulls up the text. So we may not want that. Maybe we should give it a default value, something like reset, something hard-coded. That way, if the event.target.value equals reset, we don't do this. We just go ahead and call our get movies again. And that's one way that we could do this. Not the only way, mind you, just one way. So let's try this out. If e.target.value equals reset, then get movies. Else, go and get the filtered list they are requesting for. All right, again, just calling this get movies function from much, much earlier. So let's try that again. We'll refresh. We'll go to action. Then we'll go back to all movies. And there we go, that works just fine. Now we could maybe change the wording of that to be a little bit more explanatory to the user. Something like all movies, so they know it's an actual selection to make. A little easier to see. All right, so by default, all movies. Now action. Now fantasy. Now back to all movies. And this is any site you go to that has filtered views like Amazon or really any e-commerce or robust site you've been to. This is what they're using. Now that gets very complex when you're handling multiple types of queries and parameters, but this is where it all starts. All right, so make sure you implement something like this for practice, but let's take a minute or two here and just talk about some ways that we could clean this up or make it even stronger. First thing I want to state, it doesn't make too much sense to go and get all of our data again with such a small database, right? I could easily, instead of going and doing this get request to by genre, I could have just filtered out the movies I currently have and then go get them again if need be. But however, I'm accounting for a much larger database here. If we have hundreds of movies, it would make sense to go get that sub-collection whenever needed. And that would mean our initial get request probably wouldn't go get everything in our database like this one is doing here. Okay, once you get to a large database, you're going to be getting chunks at a time and waiting for the user to request more, either through pagination or some sort of filtered view. But there's a bigger problem that we could potentially run into here. Right now, the genre is user entered. So what if I entered in a new movie like Harry Potter, and I said capital F fantasy, and maybe even spelt it wrong, like fantasy or whatever. Now, this won't work in our filter. If I go here to fantasy, Harry Potter's not included because it doesn't match this exactly. So letting the user enter in something like genre that needs to be a specific thing for our database querying to work is kind of a no-go. So there's two things that could help you fix this here. One, instead of having this be a text input, create a select option dropdown like this. So the user has to choose something pre-written, and that gets away from any typos that they may accidentally put into your program. Another part to that, to even tie it down further, is going back all the way to the movie model. There is a type in Mongoose called enum. Well, sorry, the type is string, but we can make it an enum. And what enum means, I'll write it here, means the string that they give you has to be one of the following specified values. So in here I could say action, fantasy, and so on and so forth. So this reinforces the fact that anything that's saved as a genre has to be one of the genres we support. And doing that along with requiring the user to use something like a select option to create the genre will just make sure that there's no issues of a lost movie, right? I can't find Harry Potter here unless I go back to all movies because of this typo. So just a couple things to consider, but all in all, there's small changes you'd have to make. The bulk of the functionality is already done with this form and the backend route we did. So again, give yourself a little practice with this, and when you're ready, let's move on.